Think with policy, I think with leaders and policymakers in businesses, it really is to stress the importance of that return on the investment of investing in employee well-being. It might seem like a nice to have. It's really not. It goes much, much deeper than that. And for individuals, I think, you get so much more out of your life when you feel better in your body, when you feel better in your mind.
So, welcome to the Sustainability Transformation Podcast, where we explore bold ideas, key strategies, and stories which drive positive change in business and beyond. Today, we are diving into one of the overlooked topics in sustainability, which is around the health and well-being. And we are so proud to have Nancy West, who is a passionate advocate for sustainable workplaces with deep insight around how well-being connects to long-term performance, culture, and impact. And so we explore how to talk about sustainability when it comes to burnout, leadership culture, any gender differences in well-being, traditional well-being programs, and what well-being in the workplace should be or could be. So, welcome again, Nancy. Could you introduce yourself to the audience and what makes you so passionate about well-being in the workplace?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So I'm Nancy West. I'm a health and wellbeing coach. And I'm passionate about wellbeing in the workplace because of my own struggles and journeys through that. Actually, I suffered burnout a few years ago myself and have been on quite a journey kind of recovering from that and now helping other people through their wellbeing journeys as well. I can see the impact of stress is huge in people's lives. I also think that there's a really amazing opportunity in business to really support the well-being of individuals. I think we all do have our own personal responsibility for well-being, but I think that there's a real platform within workplaces. We spend so much time at work, right? That this is such an important topic to be bringing up and to be supporting in the workplace. Yeah.
Good. Thanks for sharing that. As an outsider of knowledge within the well-being space, is it fair to say that there is a fundamental difference between well-being and mental health? And also, it's been a recent consciousness or awareness.
I think when we think about well-being or health, if we think about health, I think we often think of physical health, don't we? And I think the conversation around mental health has been increasing so much over the last few years, which is, you know, good on one hand, but probably the reason why it's been increasing is because mental health itself has become more of an issue in our lives and in workplaces in particular. I don't necessarily always see a massive separation between physical health and mental health, because I can see as a health coach when I'm working with clients that actually by supporting physical health, we also support the mental health of individuals. But it's not to say that mental health doesn't exist on its own either. So yeah, I think the rising conversation around mental health is really needed. And I think we're also living in a world that is rapidly changing. We're having to adapt to, a very fast-paced lifestyle in many cases. And I think we can't ignore the conversation about mental health. It's really important. But the two work in tandem, I think, physical health and mental health. We need to be talking about them together.
Yeah, that's good. So, again, from a sustainability enthusiast perspective, what drew me towards the topic of well-being? And, this show is for me to learn, and hopefully the listeners will learn with me on a journey. The sustainability has the environment, social, and economic. And within the social, the easy word I used to explain is people,
Mm.
whether people in workplace or people in the community. Now, this is where we're talking about well-being within businesses. So could you perhaps define what is a sustainable well-being in a business context? And perhaps another insight to show why I'm asking this is sometimes as a non-expert in the well-being, starting to look into the well-being initiatives by companies, it may appear to be a number of perks, or you have these medical insurance or dental insurance, or you have these. How would you define a well-being which is sustainable in a business context, which is more people oriented?
Yeah, that's a great question. When we think about sustainability, you're right, we quite often think about like looking after the planet, but such a core part of that is who's looking after the planet, and it's the people, as you've rightly pointed out. And it's the same in business. Our all businesses have resources, right? We all have technology, or you might have a building, and humans are part of that resource. Your people are part of that resource. And so the health of that resource is really important to how the business grows and how it performs. And, a sustainable business is one that lasts, right? So we need to think about sustainable practices within business beyond, perks like free fruit and yoga classes, which are, nice to haves, but it's not a strategy, right? It's not a strategy that's going to drive the business forward. And I really do believe that by incorporating well-being into business strategy has a huge immense power. You can really, by raising it and bringing it to the forefront of business objectives to some extent, I think it's an investment worth making. People are, we all, if you think, get back to the point about sustainability and how, we're looking after the planet. If people are feeling healthy and well within themselves, they are much more likely to give back out into into their environment, into their workplaces, into their surrounding communities. However, if they're unwell or they're struggling in some ways, that is much less likely to happen. And so by supporting well-being in individuals and helping well-beings also to support themselves as well, which I think is a big part of it, you're enabling a healthy workforce to be able to give back, to give out into the business, to perform at their best, to come into collaboration with other people. Flip side of that would be unhealthy employees struggling, maybe with their health, maybe with their energy, maybe with their mental health and ability to communicate. These things can, really hold a business back if we imagine that flip side.
As you mentioned, one of the words I picked from was perform. And so
Mm.
I'm trying to link performance to productivity. And so if employees are able to perform, yes, it's good for their own individual life because they're able to be, a better person individually or for the people they care about or people care about them, family and so on, friends, network, community. But the key part perhaps I would like to dive in is the productivity within the company. So I don't know the specific stats, but majority of the reasons that people call in sick has to do with stress. Now, that is an indicator that if you're having less people being able to be more productive, then it is a business issue. It is not something which is a sustainability issue where it's nice to do, but it is actually affecting. And that's where I mentioned about sustainability being environment, social, and economic. So this social issue becomes an economic issue.
100%. I mean, to bring to my own experience to that, I said at the beginning, I suffered from burnout a number of years ago, and that resulted in me being signed off work sick for a number of weeks. Not only did I struggled with that idea because I felt so guilty about like all of the workload that I was handling, someone else then had to handle. So that's a cost. That's a cost on some other human resource in the business. It's also a cost probably, if I was working sales at the time, it was a cost to my customers. It was cost to the business in terms of sales. I had to down tool. So it all comes back to that cost. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It does have an economic impact, a big one.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. So what are some of the common or typical well-being challenges you are seeing in the workplace today? If you may share maybe, one or two, please.
Yeah, well, you mentioned stress in your, and I think that is probably the number one. Um, and we have to remember it's not just stress from work. It's stress from all, it could be from all different areas of our lives, can feed into it. Our lives are not separated out into these separate bits. Whatever happens in work has feeds into our home life. Whatever happens in our home life feeds into work life. So I think stress is a big factor. And when I'm working with clients as well, probably 90% of the time, the underlying factor to their symptoms and the things that they're struggling with, whether it's sleep problems, whether it's anxiety, whether it's hormonal dysfunction in women, that all stress always underpins it. And I think we as humans need to recognize stress as one of the biggest kind of health problems we have in our society. And then when we come back to business, recognizing that we all need support with stress, no matter how resilient you might think you are. I think, sometimes the people that burn out are the ones that are the hardest workers. They're the ones that push themselves the hardest. So we need to be really mindful of stress. We need to be mindful of our nervous systems, taking proper breaks, and workplaces really need to be encouraging this and being vocal. I think one of the problems about stress is people don't talk about it. Sometimes people don't even recognize their stress because we're so wired, we're so used to being like running on cortisol all of the time that we get kind of used to this kind of feeling of kind of consciously on, switched on all the time. And our world is a stressful place. We've got technology, we're constantly stimulated, the news is stressful. So we've got constant micro stresses adding to our day throughout all of the day, whether we're at home or at work. And I think there's two things here. Again, there's a personal kind of awareness, maybe managing your own nervous system or managing your own stress, but the workplace really needs to help with this. And again, like you just pointed out before, it is in their own interest to help with this because at the end of the day, that stress will cost not just the employee, but the business as well.
Yeah, no, that's very good insight. Yeah, I've got a question which is a very difficult one in terms
Mm.
of individuals have to take responsibility for their own actions. For example, sleep. Let's pretend I'm a people director and I've noticed through employee survey that there is issues of distress. How do you advise me to be able to navigate where there is personal responsibility of the individuals because ultimately they have to get their own sleep in various patterns again, picking just one or two of them. But the ultimate part of the question is how do employers or leaders manage that corporate or their strategy, but also personal responsibility without encroaching on people's rights and so on. So yeah, hopefully, you can tease out that aspect.
That's a tough one, isn't it? Oh, so I think, I think what businesses can do better, or many businesses can do better, is be more open. Let's talk about things more. Let's make these conversations happen in workplaces. And it's it's kind of like where I pointed out at the beginning, where we're sort of making well-being front and center of kind of business strategy. Mm, that awareness helps individuals to kind of, okay, am I taking the right responsible actions that I need to be taking? And I guess, you know, if the company has enough resources, they can help with training and things like that. They can bring people in to talk about the physical and mental benefits of sleep, for example. But yeah, it's a tricky one. I think, there are certain boundaries, I think, as individuals we need to put in place, but also workplaces need to support. For example, emailing at 10 o'clock at night, not expecting a response at that time, making sure that people know that they don't expect that response, and that they don't have to answer, even if you're someone who is working late and you've chosen to do that. Making sure that that communication is really clear, because otherwise people can get, especially in the younger generations, when we're early on in your career, you might think that you've got to reply to every email very, very quickly or something like that. Remind me of your question again. So it was.
Yeah, so no, I knew it was always going to be a difficult issue with that. So yeah, don't focus so much on. I think one of the key parts of asking that question, perhaps the next one we will look at is how can people, directors or HR or leaders who are responsible for well-being, how can they embed that
Yeah.
as a company culture? Because again, I'm going to quote one of Peter Drucker says culture is strategy for breakfast. And in other words, if the culture is not in favor of the well-being, for example, if there is a culture of not supporting or understanding the differences in the characteristics or needs, how would you advise these people leaders to embed well-being to become a company culture so that if the leader leaves the company, for example, this initiative doesn't fall off, which I have noticed in other sustainability in general, where you have a CEO who's really into sustainability, helps the company prove sustainability is good, but then for some reason when the CEO leaves, everything changes. But if it's part of the culture, it doesn't matter who the leader is. So perhaps that's where the question is
Yeah,
around.
yeah, okay, yeah. So I think you're right. Yeah, I think there is your culture trickles down from the top, doesn't it? You've just pointed out. So it has to be led by the top, but it has to be followed through the different layers. I think if you were talking to a people manager, people engagement manager or something like that, the strategy needs to be very clear. It needs to be fed back to managers of teams and managers as well. Actually, managers also need to have training in this area. Quite often people are promoted to being a manager because they were good at that job, but have they been trained on how to work with teams, get the best out of their teams, support people through tricky times? And so I think training is a big part of it. And embedding it in that culture, I do think it is about communication. I think also giving some autonomy to the workforce to kind of to inspire what that looks like for them, rather than just saying, we do well-being, this is how we do well-being. It's like, how would you like to see well-being in this company done? And I've seen other companies do things like set up, to give you an example, a menopause support group or a menopause champion within the workforce, somebody that, they're a normal employee, they have their job to do, but they are also have this vested interest in, creating a community for people to go to where they can be vocal and they can talk about things. And I think that's a good way of doing. I think that's a really good way of kind of helping that filter through the culture, because then you have these little systems that can keep going. Like you say, if the lead moves on, then somebody's there to keep supporting those ideas. So whether that is women's health or mental health, there's some really great kind of initiatives like talk clubs where you just kind of meet for coffee and you have a talk, and that gives people somewhere to go to meet people who are interested in well-being and social connection and that kind of thing. This, there's loads of ideas you could implement from that point of view. But yeah, it has to trickle down from the top. Someone has to inspire the idea, don't they? And then handing it over to people within the business.
Actually answers my next question, which was going to be how leaders can make the well-being resonate, which you've mentioned about the communication. Once you ask employees, coders, is always a good thing to talk to the various customers. And I'm pleased about the communication where you have a one-way communication, which it might be a survey, but you might not pick the nuances because surveys are pre-planned. The questions are being thought about, but it doesn't pick the questions that people are thinking about. So it's very good to know that by having like a four-room discussion, then you can have a two-way feedback. So yeah, thanks for sharing that communication part of the code. So how does the well-being differ between men and women in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for men. There are differences, certainly, for both sides. Every individual is a different individual, but I think there are some specific things about women's health that thankfully now are getting a little bit more airtime. Things like menopause awareness, menstrual awareness as well. A company I used to work for, TOTM, were getting things like menstrual products into bathrooms in workplaces, and that's an amazing initiative. And all of the businesses that are taking on initiatives like that need a good pat on the back, because it's 51% of the population are female, right? And all females will menstruate, go through menopause, and go through all these changes. And whilst it's just part of life as a female, it also can be very disruptive to your working day when going through these changes. So supporting that, having products in the workplace, period products, for example, really important. And also seeing more businesses having things like menopause policies is great to see because it recognizes the challenges that come with that. And then from the men's side, I think there's also, you talked about mental health earlier, and I think that's again another area we need to encourage more men having more conversations about how they're feeling, how their mental health. I think that's really important. I think women are better at talking to each other about these things because I think women just do that. But creating those safe spaces for men to come out with anything that they're struggling with, great initiatives, I think.
Absolutely. It's always good to have that insight. So perhaps a follow up to that. Are there any ways companies maybe unintentionally, and I'm stressing on the unintentionally, ignoring these differences where perhaps you or they need a well-being coach to help them to cover these areas where it might be in their blind spot? I know, unfortunately, there might be some which intentionally, but I think it's probably safe to say there are some who probably don't know, and then perhaps they need opportunities to correct these unintentional mistakes. If you can shed some light on that, yeah.
100%. Yeah, you don't know what you don't know, right? It's like you can't live the experience of everybody else. So it's uh I think now that we are having more conversations, for example, around women's health, that's helping. But you might have some settings, for example, I've just taken off the top of my head example of the construction industry, for example, which is very male dominated. You wouldn't necessarily expect lots of kind of, when women's well-being kind of stuff implemented into that. However, it is starting to get recognized that actually there is a greater need for equality. And yeah, and so I guess you need those leaders, don't you? You need those people with that insight to come in and kind of just raise awareness. There are now, we have International Women's Day and things like that. We have all of those things that are helping to raise awareness. But yeah, I think it's not an intentional neglection of those aspects of life. But I think it's not always easy, I think, for people to approach these topics. I feel very comfortable about talking about them because it's part of my job, but it's not comfortable for everybody. So bringing in someone who is comfortable to talk about that and raising those conversations, starting those conversations, could be a good strategy.
Yeah, that's good. So we talked about those traditional the gym memberships and the yoga classes and the free fruits where it may just at the moment not fulfilling the potential. So how would, let's say you have a people or you have an engagement leader, listening, and they would like you to help them adapt, improve these perks and these traditional initiatives so it's more comprehensive and it's achieving its results.
Mm.
How would you advise them? I know, a few seconds is not enough to give them, but if you give them something which perhaps they can contact you after this, perhaps, yeah.
Yeah, I think, those things are all nice. They're nice to have, nice fruit, nice yoga classes, but it's not necessarily getting to the root cause of the health and well-being issues that could be going on in a company. It's not necessarily helping to raise the conversations around stress, for example. So I think it's better to think about the root cause. And I think sometimes employee surveys and monitoring tools can be useful to monitor, levels of stress and how people are feeling about things. They can be useful, but it's about what you're going to actually do with that. What are you just adding another yoga class isn't going to necessarily get to the root of that problem. I've seen a few businesses do, and again, bringing someone like myself into a business could help with this. Is like having a workshop where you actually look at so an exercise that I use in my coaching quite frequently is called the Wheel of Life. And it takes an individual to kind of rate different areas of their life, whether it's their health, their work, their finances, their relationships. All of these things have an impact on all of the other things. And what this can really help do is help someone become aware of an area of life that they can nurture themselves. And then and then create tangible actions around it, and providing for workplaces to provide that idea and the space for people to explore that could be a good way of helping people to again take that kind of personal action, whether it is their own health or things going on outside of work. So I think, yeah, it's perhaps slightly more, what's the word I'm looking for?
Aware or conscious or
But yeah, there's a consciousness, like a mindfulness element to it, I suppose. That's, rather than it just being ticking a box, it's like, actually, let's see if we can like provide some tools that can really help people in their own journeys. And it's difficult with these things because not everybody's the same. You're not always, everyone's going to have their own, but it's quite nice to have those individual tools that make it a personalized experience, that each individual can get something out of it. I just thought of something else I was going to say. Which is,
you mentioned about the mindfulness.
yeah, mindfulness is a funny one because it turns some people off if you talk about mindfulness, but I do think there's a real place for it in business and in workplaces. I think because it's that space to reflect, rather than just keep going, pushing, 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 pushing. Having that space to stop, pause, come to the present moment and reflect. In individuals, it's one of the key parts of my own well-being, but I think in business that has relevance too, because you need to take stock. You need to, um, yeah, to pause, to take a moment for the business as a whole. That might be for creating your next quarter's strategy, but
Yeah.
also for employees to have that time to reflect on how, maybe how the changes they might like to see in the workplace or things that they might want to do for themselves.
So this next segment is on the LinkedIn and PwC report, which have highlighted some of the key challenges that employees are facing.
Mm.
And so I'm going to share some of them and see where well-being and productivity may be of use. So the LinkedIn report, which came out early 2025, top 5 reasons why employees are struggling to engage with sustainability and other key issues. You have the first one on the opportunity to work in innovative projects, learn in demand skills. There is a flexible work arrangement, challenging and impactful work. And then the PwC starts with the first one, unfulfilling work, concerns with the mental health, the lack of career growth, poor workplace culture. So I know it's a few of them, but perhaps if you focus on the unfulfilling work,
Yeah.
the concerns with the mental health and the poor workplace culture, which sort of resonates with the LinkedIn one as well. So I think we've discussed some of these already, but I'm personally quite keen on this because employers are paying significant amount of money to employ people to come on board, and the employee churn, which is, how is it 18 months, 2 years, sometimes in some sectors even less. So how can employers navigate these research, which is confirming the common reasons why? Yes, there are financial reasons there as well, which is always a very difficult one to
Yeah.
jump the financial reasons. But this list the culture, the well-being, and those aspects, they were number one, two, and three, even before the financial difficulties as well. So
Mm.
perhaps you can tease out how companies can grapple with these. Is it from data? Is it from these initiative measuring and monitoring?
Yeah, I think in terms of fulfillment and that kind of feeling of purpose at work, I think that's really important. We all want to feel like we have purpose, right? And the workplace is a huge provider of that for many of us. I've worked for companies or in companies that could do a better job of explaining what the purpose is. Why go through all the trouble of doing what you have to do on a day-to-day basis? So having that really strong purpose and having that clearly defined and communicated throughout the business. And again, we come back to the topic of culture, because again, that has to be fed through all of those different aspects, is really important, but also giving the individual purpose about what their role is doing, what impact can they make with what they're doing, making that really clear to them. And also, what impact do they want to make? How can we help make that happen for them in their work? Because that's going to help them keep engaged. That's going to help them stay longer, be more loyal to the company, cost less in, recruitment fees, all of those things, when people have got purpose and they've got a reason to get up in the morning, that's going to make them bring their best selves to work, I think. So purpose is a really big one. I'm really glad you brought that up from those articles, those reports, because I think there's probably a lot of people out there that are lacking that feeling of purpose in their roles. That it's the responsibility of the business to give them that purpose, really.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. And then, with mental health, all of it feeds into each other, doesn't it?
Yeah. It does actually. Yeah.
You mentioned about data monitoring services, things like that. I think if you're not monitoring employee well-being, you're running you're going blind basically. You need to be monitoring it in some way or another. Now that will depend on the business. I think the bigger the business is, the harder it is for leadership and management to know what's going on within the ranks of the business. So some sort of, employee engagement tools, surveys, monitoring tools. I think there's one called Culture Amp that that people can engage with. That can be quite useful. For smaller businesses, it doesn't have to be that, formal. It could be conversations that you have, regular check-ins, one-to-ones with your managers, those sorts of things, and still you can still monitor the vibe in the business. That's the only way you'll pick up on something like someone having a mental health challenge. You won't necessarily know it until they break, and that's then when everything, you know, it's that's the you don't want to get to that point. You want to be able to prevent burnout rather than getting to the point where someone's, had to leave the business because they couldn't hack it anymore. And that isn't always necessarily to do with work. That could be to do with stuff outside of work. But knowing that work can have an understanding of that and support it. I think about things like families here, parents of children when they've got kids that are sick or parents that are ill, and there's all these other responsibilities in our lives that, work have to understand that, having that flexibility and understanding of what human life's all about is really important rather than it being like you're on work time now. We haven't also talked about the whole remote working and office working, which again, I think there's huge nuances to speak about there. Don't know if you want to go into that.
Oh, no, absolutely. Yes. It was on the list for us to talk about that, but is a common topic around hybrid and after the pandemic, which forced society to work from home, and then after the pandemic, now there is the hybrid, whether 3 days in the office or 2 days in the office, and there's a lot of companies who are reluctant with that. When I say companies, the leadership of companies, and whether they think productivity is low, and there are some companies where they're actually saving on their energy bills and downsizing their cost on the footprint of their offices. If they had 10 offices, then now they have five, for example. So there's a mixed bag, but
Mm.
those who are pushing back purely because of they have the assertion, perhaps is there any data? So that comes in. What are your thoughts based from a well-being perspective, how companies can navigate this hybrid work which allows the flexibility? Again, the flexibility was in the top five in those LinkedIn and PwC reports as well. So perhaps, yeah, absolutely, let's dive in.
Yeah, I think people have got, thanks to the pandemic or not used to a slightly different level of flexibility in their work now. And there are perks to working from home, sure. There are also some significant downsides from a health and well-being perspective. I now work fully from home, but when we were in COVID, we all were kind of suddenly just transported to a world where we weren't working in the office anymore. And I'll tell you a story. I really struggled with that. I felt it, I struggled. I was quite new in a company and I didn't have the relationships yet with people within the teams. And so I felt very alone. I felt very kind of, and that's nothing against what the company were doing. They were just trying to get through the pandemic. There wasn't anything, any problems from their perspective. So I think that is an issue. I think if you have got a remote working team, again, even more so, you need to be checking in and making sure that people are okay, that they're, because it's too easy, isn't it, to hide behind our, cameras off on Teams meetings and things like that. It's, there's so much more that could be going on that might be affecting their work. At the same time, just forcing people back to the office, that's not the answer, because have, found people have proven that they can work effectively from home. They can be really productive and possibly even more productive, I think, for a lot of people. And from a sustainability perspective, they're not having to travel into work anymore. They've got more time for their families, which means they're getting more fulfillment out of life. You've got all of the aspects of, gender equality in the workplace, and, women having to pick up a lot of the kind of childcare and things like that. But that's making things easier for people if they can be more flexible and can work from home and choose the hours that they work, if that's a possibility in that particular
Yeah.
job. So, there are a lot of perks, but there are a lot of challenges. I don't think it's a one size fits all. I think it depends on the company, it depends on what the objective of that company is. But I do think that actually at the core of it, the health and well-being aspect is so important. You've got to, when you're making decisions like making people come back into the office, what is the impact on people's health and well-being for that? What
Yeah.
is that gonna how is that gonna impact their morale? How is that gonna impact how they conduct themselves in their jobs? And same, if you're deciding to empty all the offices and close them all down, what is the impact of that? And then how can you mitigate that impact, from a well-being perspective? What support can you provide? I do think things like, we talked a little bit earlier about communities, but, like setting up some groups, making sure you're encouraging breaks, having some time out that's not just work, but actually just getting on a call and having a chat rather than it just being about work. Those little things, I know that then they don't have to cost anything, but they can make people feel included. Um, Yeah.
No, that's good. Thanks for sharing that insight. I think the key message there is, are you asking employees to come to the office just for the sake of it? Or there are reasons around it? And if there are reasons, have you considered the health and well-being and the community that can support it? So what is one actionable step any company, no matter the size, can take today to support employee energy, employee focus, and their perhaps mental resilience as well?
Yeah. Great question. I think really encouraging breaks and rest away from screens is really important. Some companies will have something like an enforced lunch hour or whatever, whatever that might look like. And again, from the remote working perspective, I think it's a really good idea to try and encourage this with workers so that they're not eating at their desk, never getting away from screens, not having breaks. I really do think that's going to help in the long term, help people understand how that helps them, in terms of their energy levels, how they can help to manage their own nervous systems by taking breaks away from screens. It sounds so simple, it sounds really easy. I even find this quite hard to do. When you've got work to do and you're passionate about what you do, you just want to keep doing
Yeah,
the work, don't you? But
absolutely.
you have
Yeah.
to kind of enforce it somehow, like put some sort of reminder up, or so I think that's one thing that businesses could do more. I don't know of many businesses actually doing that, but I think that could be something that would be a really great idea to implement. Obviously, get some feedback from the team. Make it work for them. Like, don't make it just like you're going to have your lunch at 1 o'clock. It's not, doesn't, see how you can make this work, but really try it again. It comes back to that cultural thing and communicating and getting these messages out there, like asking people, how many breaks have you had today? Take another one.
Always good to check in and, delivering a fulfilling work. That fulfilling work could then become a challenge of not taking enough breaks. And then that could then over time lead to
Mhm.
burnout. So there's a lot we've covered now. As we coming closer to the end, let's say you have a engagement officer or a people director or HR person say, okay, I like all of these topics that we've covered, and I am looking for is initial period, maybe short term, maybe 6 months or so, or you have a different leader who needs help from a well-being perspective to bring all of these things that we've talked about, no doubt. we've only touched the surface. What does a long-term transformation look like, and what does a short-term quick fix?
Well, I mean, short term, I do think something like that wheel of life exercise or a workshop or something like that could be really useful for employees to, help to show that the business cares. That's really important, to show the business cares about their well-being, but also to give them that opportunity to explore individually what actually would support my well-being more. What could I do to help to make that happen? That could be a really nice, interesting exercise from a short-term perspective, and it doesn't have to take very long. It's like a half-hour exercise. From a longer-term perspective, it comes back to that culture thing, isn't it? It's about leadership really being purposeful about what well-being means for their business. Why is that important for their business? What is the return on the investment of investing in health and well-being in their business? And I can say for sure it's a good return on investment, because the cost of burnout and the cost of absenteeism and the cost of re-employing people if they've left the job is much, much higher than paying for a few well-being services. So it's worth taking the time to think about that. And I think it's worth taking the time to think about how then do we communicate that to our workforce? How do we let them know that well-being is important and that we value that their well-being, we value their opinion on it as well, and want to make it work for them. I think these employee surveys can be useful, but they can also be really not useful. I've been in companies before where they've just done it as an annual thing. It gets done and then it gets ignored, and nobody gets to see any benefit or result from it. So you really have to listen. You have to listen to what the employees are saying and take action on the things that you think, on those, you're trying to find those root causes of the problems that are there.
That's good. Yeah, good, good. So, any final advice you would give to policy leaders or businesses or even an individual that think, oh, I think I need a well-being coach? What would be your final takeaway message, please?
I think with policy, I think with leaders and policymakers in businesses, it really is to stress the importance of that return on the investment of investing in employee well-being. It might seem like a nice to have. It's really not. It goes much, much deeper than that. And for individuals, I think you get so much more out of your life when you feel better in your body, when you feel better in your mind. You have more energy, more confidence, you can perform better at work. And so even just little things like drinking enough water every day, moving your body, um, getting out into nature, which is one of my go-tos of kind of relaxing and feeling like a human being again, not just like a machine tied to a laptop. I think we can all do those little things for ourselves. But, as I said at the beginning of this conversation, we have such an opportunity for businesses to make that known, to inspire people, to have that, to be the instigator in that. So yeah, I think that's what excites me about well-being in corporate spaces, because I think it can really lead to massive change.
A huge thank you to Nancy West for sharing these incredible insights. I'm so blessed with those key details. So, if our listeners want to learn more about your work, where can they find?
Yes. So my website is nancywestwellbeing.com. I'm on Instagram at Nancy West Wellbeing, and I'm on LinkedIn as Nancy West. And I have a page called Nancy West Wellbeing, which is my business page. So yeah, I'm relatively active on there, posting articles and things like that. Yeah, feel free to get in touch. Love to have more conversations, and yeah, be great to connect.
It's great. So I'll put the link of those LinkedIn and those details Nancy has shared within the description. So if you are listening to it now, if you look at the description, it's easy for you to click on it and it will take you to these pages. So yeah, be sure to follow us on the Sustainability Transformations podcast and please subscribe for more deep dives into the future of sustainability and its impact. Thank you. So yeah, thanks, Nancy.
Well, thank you to you as well, for
Yeah.
an honour. And yeah, sustainability is a big passion of mine as well. So yeah, I think it's great what you're doing. Thanks for having